When I ran out of other options, this little corner of my office became where we stored all the shipping supplies for our DVDs. It's obvious that I need some shelves here, so I took some measurements and wrote down some numbers and headed for the shop. And that's why we're making this office shelf unit. And whenever I build a shelving unit, I like to make sure that I have at least one stud behind it that I can anchor this unit to make sure that it's not going to tip over. I need this shelf unit to be 21 inches wide. I'm going to set the shelves in 1/4 inch dados cut in a 3/4 inch thick stock, so that means that our shelves have to be 20 inches long. So I adjusted my fence distance with a stop block, and I moved that back and clamped it into place at my end of the fence. I just want to butt the wood up against this block to establish the length, and then have it come off of the block before I start making the cut. Then, after checking the miter gauge to be sure that it's square, I go ahead and cut the 3 shelves. I want to take my time with these cuts because I want to make sure that all 3 of the shelves are exactly the same width. Because if they're not, there's no way for the shelf unit to come out square. Then I installed my stacked dado set up for a 3/4 inch wide cut, adjusted its height to 1/4 inch, and then I made a couple of test cuts and some scrap just to confirm that the setup is right for my wood. I'm going to use my stop block again to control where the dados are, so I only have to lay out one board. And you notice that I draw out both sides of the dado. And that's simply because I learned the hard way how easy it is to cut a dado on the wrong side of a single layout line. And I bring those layout lines around the edge just a little bit, and I'll show you why that's so handy. Those little lines make a nice sight when you're lining the cut up on your dado stack, or in this case where I'm using a zero clearance insert set to this width, I can line the marks up with the edges of the slot. And now I can set up my stop block for this dado cut. I nearly always use a stop block for dados like this because it makes sure that the dados in both sides of the case are cut in exactly the same place. Notice I'm using the push block to hold the piece down when it goes over the dado. You want to take your time, let the dado make the cut, and not force it, otherwise the wood could rise up over the dado. Now I can use this setup to make the cut in the other upright and know that it will be placed correctly. After this, I readjusted the fence and stop block for the remaining 2 cuts and cut those dados in both of the uprights. The only real secret here is to take your time and let the saw do the work. Taking the time to get these dados right is really important. If the dados aren't cut exactly the same on both sides, you're going to have problems during assembly. I'm only going to have 3 fixed shelves, but I want to give myself options later on. So I'm using my Rockler shelf pin jig to drill holes for pins that we can add later and add more shelves if we need them. This jig makes perfectly aligned shelf pin holes dead simple to do. I'm going to use glue and screws to hold these dados together, and I found a simple way of drilling the pilot holes for the screws without having to do layout on the outside of it. And I just used this pilot hole bit. This is going to be a painted piece, and I'll spackle over the screw heads on the outside, so I'm just eyeballing the 3 pilot holes. It's easy to stay centered enough that you don't have to worry about a screw breaking through the side of the shelf on the inside. Then flip the board over, use those holes as a guide for drilling the countersinks on the outside of the board. And before we start assembly, I always sand the shelves and the insides of a bookcase or shelf unit, because it's a lot easier to get at all that stuff now. After sanding the inside surfaces of the uprights, I got out the air hose and blew the chips out of the shelf pin holes. To start assembly, I spread some glue in the dados. There's nothing fancy here, just a good wood glue, and I use a brush to make sure that we get the dado completely covered, even the edges along those shoulders on either side of it. I also apply a thin coat of glue to the end of the board that's going into the dado. We don't need a lot of glue here, I just want to make sure that this edge is wet and all the pores are covered. Then we set the board in the dado, make sure that it's seated and aligned front to back as well. At every step of the construction, I want to make sure that everything is as square as I can get it. So I use one of my assembly squares every time I put one of these boards in place. This doesn't add a whole lot of time to the job, but it makes sure that every board gets screwed into place straight. I clamped a square to the shelf on one side and used another clamp to clamp that same square to the side. I know that the square is a perfect 90 degrees, and now I know my shelf is also square to the side. Now I can run in that outside screw. You notice I only put this screw in right now. Make sure that this screw is run down all the way, and then we can remove the clamp and turn this whole assembly over. Then with the other side of the cabinet facing up, I can go ahead and put the assembly square in on the other end of the shelf. I clamp it in just like I did on the other side, making sure that my shelf is absolutely square to the side. Then I can go around the other side and install the remaining 2 screws, knowing that my shelf is still perfectly squared to the side. And I'll repeat this exact same process on the remaining 2 shelves to get them both installed on this side of the cabinet. And now I can prepare the other side of the cabinet to be installed on top of the shelves we just screwed into place. We want to make sure we put a little glue on the ends of all the shelves to make sure we get a good bond. Then I can carefully set the other side on top of the shelves. It takes a little horsing around to get all of the dados lined up with all of the shelves, but it's worth taking your time. We want all the shelves to be started in their dados, but they don't necessarily have to be completely seated. The most important thing is to make sure we have the parts aligned front to back. As we go to put the screws in, we can tap the joints together a little more if we need to seat the shelves into the dados, but we need to get this part lined up right to start with. I've already checked this end of the shelves to the upright, and they're all perfectly square, so I'm going to go ahead and put 1 screw in each end of each shelf. As I go, I want to make sure that we have that front to back alignment just right. I adjust each shelf individually and then put the screw in to lock it in place. It's just about impossible to line up a number of shelves and then go back and put screws in each one and expect everything to stay where you put it. Then I went around to the other side, checked everything for square again. Everything is still lined up, so I went ahead and put the remaining screws in, making sure that all the joints are closed up tightly. Then with all the screws in place, I go back with the square and make sure that all of the joints are still square to each other, that nothing's moved. I'll also measure the diagonals and see that the case really is square. If you're not familiar with measuring diagonals, see my box building basics story in our basics section. It explains the whole procedure to you. Here I'm installing an 1.5 inch tall screwing cleat underneath the top shelf. This strip runs from side to side between the uprights and is installed so it's flush with the back edge of the uprights and that top shelf. This is a simple way to make sure that your shelf unit is very stable. I'm going to make one of these little cutouts on the rear edge of each upright at the base. I know this cutout will be a little bit bigger than it needs to be, but that's fine, and just make sure that the cabinet will stay flush against the wall. Since this is going to be a painted piece, I'm just going to use spackle to close up the screw holes and hide them. In real time, I applied this coat, sanded it, and applied 1 more coat to get all the small holes cleaned up. Then the next day, when everything is good and dry, I final sanded it and gave everything a couple of coats of white latex paint. With the cabinet in place for installation, I want to put a strip of painter's tape below the screw strip on the back of the cabinet. Then using a stud finder, I can locate and mark the edges of a stud behind the screwing strip. We've got plenty of width to work with here, so I just make the marks on tape rather than making them on the wall or on the cabinet. These marks make it easy to hit a stud with the screw. And to make sure we don't split anything and drill a pilot hole and countersink. It's important to remember that our screw has to go through the screwing plate and the drywall before it ever hits the stud. So I'm going to use a 2 1/4 inch long screw. It's actually kind of hard to use too long of a screw, but real easy to use too short a one. And with that 1 screw installed, we don't have to worry about our bookcase tipping over. Pull the tape off and nobody yells at you about marks on the walls either. And here's my office bookshelf, all installed and ready to be loaded up. It's hard for me to imagine that I had all this stuff sitting other places in my office, but we did. But now it's a lot easier to get to and everything's a lot more organized.